A beloved bobcat stops eating, his health rapidly declining. His devoted keeper grows desperate, calling in a renowned vet for answers. But when the vet uncovers the shocking truth, it's not what anyone expected. The keeper collapses under the weight of a devastating revelation, one that connects the bobcat's pain to her own buried secret. What could tie this majestic animal's suffering to the keeper's hidden battle? And will they both survive the emotional storm ahead? This is a story of heartbreak, resilience, and the unbreakable bond that could save them both. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted long shadows across the sanctuary grounds as Laura Bennett made her daily rounds. Her weathered boots crunched on the gravel path while she moved from enclosure to enclosure, greeting each animal like an old friend. The crisp autumn air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves and fresh hay, mingling with the familiar morning sounds of stirring wildlife. "Good morning, Sophie," she called softly to the elderly deer who always waited by her fence, her tail swishing in anticipation. Laura pulled an apple from her pocket and held it out, smiling at the familiar routine they'd shared for years. Sophie's velvet nose tickled her palm as she took the treat, her gentle eyes meeting Laura's with quiet trust. The peaceful rhythm of her morning routine came to an abrupt halt when she reached Marley's enclosure. The bobcat sat hunched in the corner, his usually bright eyes dull and distant, his normally pristine fur ruffled and unwashed. His food bowl from the previous evening remained untouched, bits of premium meat now dried and unappealing. "Hey there, sweet boy," Laura coaxed, her voice gentle as she fought down her rising worry. "Not hungry again?" She pressed her hand against the fence, waiting for his familiar greeting, remembering how he usually bounded over to rub against the wire mesh. Marley's ears twitched at her voice, but he made no move to approach, his tail lying limp beside him. Laura retrieved a piece of chicken from her treat pouch, Marley's favorite, the one that usually had him purring and pacing eagerly. She clicked her tongue the way she always did before giving him a special treat, the sound echoing in the morning stillness. Still nothing. "Come on, Marley," she whispered, settling onto the bench near his enclosure, her heart heavy with concern. "Just a little bite? For me?" Rachel, the sanctuary's newest volunteer, approached with her clipboard, her sneakers quiet on the gravel path. "Everything okay, Mrs. Bennett?" "He's just being stubborn," Laura said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But the knot in her stomach grew tighter as she watched Marley listlessly paw at the ground, his movements slow and lacking their usual grace. "He hasn't eaten in a while, has he?" Rachel's voice held careful concern, her young face pinched with worry. "He'll come around," Laura replied quickly, though her hands shook slightly as she pulled out her worn notebook, its pages filled with years of careful observations. She documented Marley's symptoms: loss of appetite, lethargy, minimal response to interaction, her normally neat handwriting betraying her anxiety. Walking to the office, Laura pulled out the feeding log, its pages filled with detailed notes spanning months. Her heart sank as she confirmed her fears. Marley hadn't eaten in 2 days. She picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Green's office, her fingers automatically finding the familiar number. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bennett," the receptionist said, her voice apologetic. "Dr. Green is at a conference. The earliest we can get you in is tomorrow afternoon." Laura glanced out the window at Marley's enclosure, squinting against the glare on the glass. The bobcat hadn't moved from his corner. The setting sun cast long shadows across his usually gleaming coat, now dull and unkempt, a visible sign of his declining health. With trembling fingers, Laura reached for her emergency contact list, worn at the edges from years of use. She found the number she needed: Dr. James Tolan, exotic animal specialist. She'd been avoiding calling him, knowing his services wouldn't come cheap. But Marley's condition left her no choice. The thought of the mounting bills made her stomach clench, but she pushed the worry aside. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number, silently praying he would answer. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Laura paced the gravel parking lot, fallen leaves crunching beneath her worn boots. Her eyes darted to her watch for the 10th time in as many minutes, the morning sun catching on its scratched face. At precisely 9, a white pickup truck with mobile veterinary services printed on its side pulled into the lot, tires crackling over the loose stones. Dr. James Tolan stepped out, his salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed and his movements deliberate. His weathered face spoke of years spent treating animals both wild and domestic. He carried himself with quiet confidence as he retrieved his medical kit from the truck bed, the familiar weight of it speaking to countless similar house calls. "Mrs. Bennett?" He extended his hand, warm and professional. "I'm Dr. Tolan." Laura shook it, trying to keep her voice steady despite the worry gnawing at her insides. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Of course." His warm smile put her slightly at ease, the corners of his eyes crinkling kindly. "Why don't you show me to our patient?" They walked to Marley's enclosure, their footsteps echoing in the morning quiet, where the Bobcat remained in his corner, barely acknowledging their presence. Dr. Tolan observed silently, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the usually spirited animal's subdued behavior. "How long has he been refusing food?" he asked, jotting notes in his pad, with practiced efficiency. Laura pulled out her worn notebook, its pages dog-eared from constant use. "It started 3 days ago. He picked at his dinner on Monday, then stopped eating completely." She flipped through the pages, her finger tracing each careful entry. "I've recorded everything, his eating habits, behavior changes, even his water intake." Dr. Tolan nodded approvingly at her detailed records. "Has there been any change in his routine? New animals nearby, different caretakers?" "No, nothing's changed." Laura wrung her hands, a nervous habit she'd developed recently. "He's always been such a good eater." "We'll need to sedate him for a proper examination," Dr. Tolan said, preparing a tranquilizer dart with practiced ease. "This is perfectly safe, Mrs. Bennett. He'll just take a little nap while we check him over." The dart found its mark with a soft thump, and within minutes, Marley was sleeping peacefully on his bed of straw. Dr. Tolan entered the enclosure and began his examination, his movements gentle but thorough. He checked Marley's temperature, tested his hydration levels, and drew blood for analysis, all while maintaining a reassuring commentary. "No signs of infection," he muttered, gently palpating Marley's abdomen with experienced hands. "No parasites evident. He's lost some weight, but there's no obvious injury or illness that I can detect." Laura's stomach tightened into a familiar knot of anxiety. "Then what's wrong with him?" Dr. Tolan stood, removing his gloves with a snap that seemed too loud in the quiet morning air. "Mrs. Bennett, in cases like this, when we can't find a physical cause, we often need to consider psychological factors. Animals, especially those in captivity, can be very sensitive to changes in their environment or the emotional state of those around them." "Psychological?" Laura frowned, her fingers unconsciously touching the spot where her own recent medical news lay heavy in her chest. "Yes. Sometimes an animal's behavior can mirror the stress or anxiety of those closest to them." He paused, choosing his words carefully, his kind eyes studying her face. "Has anything in your life changed recently? Any significant stress?" Laura felt her chest tighten as she watched Marley's sleeping form, his sides rising and falling peacefully. The question hung in the air, unanswered, while memories of white hospital corridors and grave-faced doctors flashed through her mind. The setting sun cast long shadows through Laura's office window as she sat across from Dr. Tolan. Her desk was crowded with stacks of manila folders, wildlife reference books, and a framed photo of a younger Laura holding baby Marley. A half-empty cup of coffee had grown cold beside her computer monitor, forgotten during their conversation. Dr. Tolan cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "I've reviewed all the test results." He placed the folder on her desk, careful not to disturb the precarious pile of papers. "Physically, Marley is fine. No infections, no organ problems, nothing that would explain his behavior." Laura's shoulders slumped, and she absently smoothed a wrinkle in her worn denim shirt. "But something must be wrong. He's barely eaten in days. I've tried everything, even his favorite treats." "Mrs. Bennett," Dr. Tolan leaned forward, his voice gentle, weathered hands clasped on the desk. "In my 20 years of working with exotic animals, I've seen remarkable examples of emotional bonds between animals and their caretakers. Sometimes, when the person they're closest to is struggling, they mirror that distress." "I don't understand what you mean." Laura's voice turned defensive, her fingers drumming nervously on the desk. "I'm perfectly fine." "Are you?" He held her gaze, compassion evident in his lined face. "Because Marley's behavior suggests otherwise. Animals, especially those we've raised from infancy, can be incredibly perceptive to our emotional state. They sense things we try to hide." Laura's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee mug. The ceramic felt cold against her fingers, reminding her how long she'd been avoiding this conversation. "There's nothing wrong with me," she insisted, but her voice cracked, betraying the lie. "Laura," Dr. Tolan said softly, using her first name with careful familiarity, "whatever you're going through, it's affecting Marley too. He needs you to be honest, with yourself and others." The dam broke. Tears spilled down Laura's cheeks as she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the office fan, "Stage 2 breast cancer. They found it 3 weeks ago." Dr. Tolan waited patiently as Laura wiped her eyes with a tissue, her hand shaking as she dabbed at her face. "I haven't told anyone," she continued, crumpling the tissue between her fingers. "Not even my daughter, Molly. We haven't spoken in years, and She gestured helplessly. "I found Marley when he was just a tiny thing, barely alive. His mother had been killed by a car. He needed me then, and now." "Now you're both hurting," Dr. Tolan finished gently, offering her another tissue from the box on her desk. Laura nodded, her voice breaking. "I'm so scared of losing him, of leaving him, of leaving everything I've built here." She looked around her cluttered office, at the sanctuary she'd poured her heart into for so many years. "What if I can't beat this?" "Marley can recover," Dr. Tolan assured her, his tone carrying the weight of experience. "But he needs you to take care of yourself first. This isn't a burden you should carry alone." Laura stared at her hands, the weight of her secret suddenly unbearable. The thought of facing her diagnosis, of telling Molly, made her chest tight with anxiety. Outside her window, the last rays of sunlight painted the sanctuary grounds in shades of gold, a reminder of how quickly time was passing. The autumn sun hung high in the cloudless sky as Laura made her rounds at the sanctuary. She moved from enclosure to enclosure, her movements automatic after years of routine. But her mind wasn't on her tasks. It kept drifting back to Dr. Tolan's words about Marley and emotional bonds. She paused, watching Marley through the fence of his enclosure. He lay curled in his usual corner, his food bowl untouched since morning. "Please eat something," she whispered. Rachel appeared beside her with fresh water buckets. "I've finished cleaning the fox den, Laura. Should I start on the weekly inventory?" "What?" "Oh, yes." Laura rubbed her temples. "Just make sure you—" she stopped mid-sentence, realizing she'd forgotten to lock the deer enclosure. Hurrying back, she fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking. Rachel approached with a clipboard. "Laura, I noticed we're running low on—" "Can't you handle anything yourself?" Laura snapped, immediately regretting her harsh tone when she saw Rachel's hurt expression. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" The world suddenly tilted sideways. Laura grabbed the fence for support, but her legs gave way. The last thing she heard was Rachel's alarmed cry and running footsteps before everything went dark. When she opened her eyes, Dr. Tolan and Rachel were helping her onto a wooden bench. The doctor pressed a water bottle into her trembling hands. "I'm fine," Laura protested weakly. The animals need you healthy," Dr. Tolan cut in firmly. "When's the last time you ate? Or slept properly?" Laura stared at the water bottle, avoiding their concerned faces. "I've been busy. There's so much work." Rachel touched her shoulder gently. "Let me handle things for the rest of the day. Please?" "But the feeding schedules, the medications—" "I know them all," Rachel assured her. "I've been here long enough." Dr. Tolan's expression was stern. "This isn't a request, Laura. You need rest." Finally nodding, Laura allowed them to help her to her office. She sank into her chair, watching through the window as Rachel confidently moved through the sanctuary grounds. The young volunteer knew exactly what needed doing, yet Laura had been too stubborn to let anyone help. Alone in the growing shadows of her office, Laura faced the truth she'd been avoiding. Her secret wasn't protecting anyone, not Marley, not her staff, and certainly not herself. The thought of calling Molly made her stomach clench with fear, but she couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. The morning air was crisp and cool as Laura settled onto the wooden bench outside Marley's enclosure. Her fingers trembled as she gripped her phone in one hand and clutched his favorite dried fish treat in the other. Through the wire mesh, she could see Marley curled up in his usual corner, his beautiful spotted coat dulled by days without grooming. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, pressing her free hand against the fence. "I thought I was protecting everyone by keeping quiet." Laura scrolled through her phone contacts, stopping at Molly's name. The photo next to it showed her daughter on her college graduation day, the last time they truly smiled together. Her thumb hovered over the call button as memories flooded back. She remembered Molly at 8 years old, helping to bottle feed an orphaned deer fawn. Then at 12, crying because Laura had missed her piano recital to care for a sick eagle. At 17, screaming that the animals always came first. And finally, at 29, walking away after their last explosive argument. "You care more about these animals than your own family." Molly's words still echoed in her mind, sharp and painful, even 5 years later. Laura pressed the call button, but quickly ended it before it could ring. Her heart raced as she took deep breaths to steady herself. The morning turned to afternoon, and she tried again, getting as far as 2 rings before hanging up. "What would I even say?" she asked Marley, who flicked an ear in response but remained still. "Hi, honey. Sorry I've been a terrible mother, but I'm sick now and need help." "That's not fair to her." As the sun began its descent, painting the sanctuary in soft orange light, Laura knew she couldn't put it off any longer. With shaking fingers, she dialed one last time. When the voicemail beeped, she closed her eyes. "Molly, it's Mom," she began, her voice wavering. "I know it's been a long time, and I know I have no right to ask, but—" She swallowed hard. "I need you to come home. Please. Things aren't— I'm not—" A tear rolled down her cheek. "I miss you, sweetheart, and I need your help." After hanging up, Laura sat in silence as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in deep purples and blues. She turned to Marley's quiet form in the growing darkness. I don't know if she'll come, she whispered, but I had to try. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the sanctuary's gravel parking lot as the silver sedan pulled in, its tires crunching on the loose stones. Molly Bennett sat in her car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as she stared at the familiar wooden sign. Second Chance Wildlife Sanctuary. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and retrieved her suitcase from the trunk. The sanctuary looked frozen in time. The same weathered buildings, the same creaking gate, even the same wind chimes tinkling softly from the main house's porch. Laura emerged from her office, wringing her hands nervously as she approached her daughter. "Molly," she said softly, opening her arms for a hug. Molly allowed the embrace but quickly pulled away, her body stiff and unyielding. "Why did you call me, Mom?" Molly's voice was tight with tension. "After 5 years of silence, why now?" Laura fidgeted with the hem of her worn denim shirt. I've been having some trouble here at the sanctuary. Marley's sick, and I could use an extra pair of hands." "Marley? The Bobcat?" Molly's eyes narrowed as she glanced toward his enclosure. "What's wrong with him?" "He stopped eating," Laura explained. "Dr. Tolan's been here to check on him, but—" "And you've tried everything? Called other vets?" Molly's questions came rapid-fire, accusatory. "Or are you just letting him waste away like everything else around here?" Laura flinched. "Of course I've tried. Dr. Tolan is the best exotic animal vet in 3 states. I would never—" Okay, Molly cut her off, seeing her mother's distress. "I'll stay for a few days, that's it. Just until you get things sorted out." Laura led Molly to the guest room in the main house, pushing open the creaky door to reveal a small space that seemed untouched since Molly's last visit. A patchwork quilt covered the twin bed, and framed wildlife photographs lined the walls, most of them taken by Molly's father before he passed. "The sheets are fresh," Laura said quietly. "The bathroom stocked with clean towels and—" "It's fine, Mom. I remember where everything is." Left alone to unpack, Molly's eyes fell on a framed photograph on the nightstand. It showed a younger version of herself, maybe 12 years old, sandwiched between her parents at a county fair. They were all smiling, her father's arm protectively around both of them. Without hesitation, Molly turned the frame face down on the nightstand, but her hand lingered on its edge, her expression a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The early morning mist clung to the sanctuary grounds as Laura and Molly made their rounds. Laura carried a bucket of fresh vegetables, while Molly lugged bags of feed. They worked in silence, broken only by Laura's quiet instructions about which animals got what food. "The deer get the Timothy hay," Laura murmured, not meeting Molly's eyes. "And Martha, the raccoon, needs her supplements crushed into her food." Molly nodded stiffly, following her mother's lead but keeping her distance. The familiar sense of hay and earth stirred memories of childhood mornings spent doing these same chores. Though back then, the silence hadn't felt so heavy. When they reached Marley's enclosure, Laura's face fell. The Bobcat lay curled in his usual corner, his food bowl untouched from the night before. "Oh, Marley," Laura whispered, pressing her hand against the fence. "Please eat something, sweetie." Molly watched as her mother cooed and pleaded with the cat, her throat tightening. It was just like when she was 12 and had made the softball team. Mom had missed the first game because a fox kit needed around-the-clock care. "Maybe we should try a different food," Laura suggested, her voice trembling. "He sometimes likes the chicken better than—" "Is this why you called me?" Molly burst out, her patience snapping. "To watch you fuss over a bobcat while we pretend everything's fine between us?" Laura turned, startled. "Molly, 5 years, Mom. 5 years of silence, and you call me back for this? Not to talk about us, not to fix anything, just to help with the animals? That's not fair," Laura protested weakly. "I'm doing the best I can." "Your best?" Molly laughed bitterly. "Your best has always been for them, never for me." Unable to stand there any longer, Molly stormed off, walking aimlessly through the sanctuary paths. She found herself by the old pond, where Rachel was cleaning out water bowls. "She means well, you know," Rachel said quietly, setting down a bowl. "Laura's she's never been good at showing it the right way." Molly didn't respond, but she slowed her pace, listening. "She struggles with the balance," Rachel continued, "between the animals and everything else. Always has, from what I can tell." That evening, passing by her mother's room, Molly heard muffled sobs through the thin walls. She paused, hand raised to knock, but couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she retreated to the guest room, lying on her bed and staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. The childhood resentment still burned in her chest, but now it mingled with something else, a nagging worry about her mother's tears, about the exhaustion in her eyes, about all the things left unsaid between them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sanctuary as Molly walked toward Marley's enclosure, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. She found her mother sitting cross-legged on the ground, staring at the listless Bobcat. Laura's shoulders were slumped, making her look smaller than Molly remembered. "Thought you might need this," Molly said softly, holding out one of the cups. Laura looked up, surprise flickering across her tired face. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "I could help, you know," Molly offered after a moment. "With Marley. Maybe a fresh pair of hands would make a difference." Laura hesitated, then nodded slowly. "The enclosure needs cleaning, and his food bowl should be changed." They worked together in companionable silence, Molly raking while Laura gathered fresh bedding. As they finished, Laura paused, leaning against her rake. "I found him right over there," she said, pointing to a cluster of trees beyond the fence. "He was just a tiny thing, badly hurt. Someone had shot his mother." Her voice grew soft with memory. "He wouldn't have survived another night alone." Molly stopped working, watching as her mother's eyes grew distant. "He used to chase butterflies," Laura continued, a small smile playing at her lips. "He'd bounce around like a spring, trying to catch them with his paws." "I remember that," Molly said quietly. "I watched him once, when I was supposed to be doing my homework in your office. I was jealous that he made you laugh more than I did." Laura's face fell, but Molly shook her head. "I'm not saying it to hurt you, Mom. I understand better now, seeing you with him." They prepared Marley's next meal together, Laura showing Molly exactly how to mix his favorites. Though the Bobcat still wouldn't eat, something had shifted between mother and daughter. Molly approached the enclosure carefully, extending her hand through the bars. Marley's fur was soft under her fingers, and she felt a strange connection to this creature who had been such a big part of her mother's life. Laura watched them, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Dr. Tolan knelt beside Marley's sleeping form, his experienced hands gentle as he checked the Bobcat's vital signs. Laura and Molly stood nearby, watching anxiously as the vet completed his examination. "His physical condition hasn't changed much," Dr. Tolan said, standing up and brushing off his pants. "But I have an idea that might help." They followed him to Laura's cramped office, where maps and animal care schedules covered the walls. Dr. Tolan settled into a chair, his expression thoughtful. "Laura, I believe Marley needs more than just medical treatment. He needs emotional healing, and that starts with you." Molly crossed her arms. "What exactly does that mean?" "I'm suggesting structured sessions where Laura spends time inside Marley's enclosure, focusing on projecting hope and positive energy. Animals, especially those with strong bonds like Marley has with your mother, can sense our emotional states. That sounds... Molly hesitated, her skepticism clear. Is there any real evidence this works? Dr. Tolan smiled patiently. I've seen remarkable recoveries when we address the emotional connection between animals and their caregivers. Laura, would you be willing to try? Laura nodded quickly. I'll do anything to help him. Dr. Tolan pulled out a notepad and wrote detailed instructions. Start with 30-minute sessions twice daily. Talk to him, share stories, focus on happy memories. Molly, you're welcome to participate if you'd like. That afternoon, Laura sat cross-legged in Marley's enclosure, her voice soft as she spoke to him. Remember when you first came here? You were such a tiny thing, all fuzzy ears and wobbly legs. From her spot near the fence, Molly watched her mother's gentle interactions with Marley. She'd never seen this side of Laura before. Vulnerable, open, completely focused on connecting with another being. As the sun began to set, Laura approached Molly by the sanctuary's main building. Would you, she paused, gathering courage, would you like to join me for tomorrow's session? It might help all of us heal. The morning sun cast long shadows across Marley's enclosure as Molly followed her mother through the gate. She settled onto a wooden stump, keeping her distance from both Laura and Marley. I used to do this when you were little, Laura began softly, her eyes on Marley. Sit here for hours, talking to the animals. Molly watched as Marley's ears twitched at Laura's voice. Her mother spoke with such tenderness, a tone Molly barely remembered from her childhood. Days passed, and slowly, Molly found herself sharing too. Remember when Dad built that treehouse? She said one morning. I wanted it to be my special place, but you turned it into a recovery space for injured birds. Laura's hands trembled slightly. I thought I was doing the right thing. I've always struggled with balance. During their fourth session, Laura's voice cracked. There's something I need to tell you, Molly. She took a shaky breath. I have cancer. Stage 2. That's why I called you home. I'm scared, not just for Marley, but for leaving you both behind. Molly's chest tightened. Everything suddenly made sense. Her mother's exhaustion, the urgent call home. Growing up, I felt like the sanctuary always came first, Molly admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Every school play, every soccer game, you were always here instead. Laura wiped tears from her cheeks. I thought I could save everything broken that came my way, but I ended up breaking something precious instead, us. As they talked, Marley lifted his head, watching them with newfound interest. He stretched, padding closer to where they sat. Look, Laura whispered, pointing to Marley's food bowl. They watched in stunned silence as Marley approached his meal and took a few small bites. Their eyes met across the enclosure, and for the first time in years, mother and daughter shared a moment of pure hope. The evening settled over the sanctuary, bringing with it a gentle calm. Laura sank into her worn leather couch, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her heart lighter after seeing Marley eat. Through the window, she could see his enclosure illuminated by the security lights. Molly stood by the bookshelf, an old photo album open in her hands. Her fingers traced the edges of a faded photograph, herself at 8 years old trying to show Laura a drawing while her mother tended to an injured deer. I'll do better, Marley, Laura's voice drifted through the partially open window. I was so afraid of losing everything that I pushed everyone away, even my own daughter. Molly's hand stilled on the album. She'd never heard her mother sound so vulnerable. I don't know how much time I have left, Laura continued, her voice breaking, and I've wasted so many years. Setting the album aside, Molly walked into the living room. Laura looked up, surprised to see tears in her daughter's eyes. Mom, Molly's voice was barely a whisper. I need to tell you something. She sat on the opposite end of the couch. Growing up, I felt like I was never enough, like the sanctuary always came first. Laura's shoulders slumped. After your father died, I threw myself into the sanctuary. It was easier than facing the pain, easier than risking more loss. I used to sit in my room for hours, Molly continued, waiting for you to come read me a bedtime story. But there was always another emergency, another animal that needed you more. I thought I was teaching you independence, Laura admitted, but really, I was just running away. I'm so sorry, Molly. I failed you as a mother. The words hung between them, heavy with years of unspoken hurt. Then Molly moved closer, reaching for her mother's hand. I missed you, she whispered. Even when I was angry, I missed you so much. Laura pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. They clung to each other, tears flowing freely now. I can't change the past, Laura said softly, but I want to do better now. If you'll let me. Molly nodded against her mother's shoulder. It won't be easy, she said, but I want to try. The morning sun warmed Marley's enclosure as Laura and Molly stepped inside. The air felt different today, lighter somehow, as if last night's honest conversation had cleared away years of built-up tension. Remember how you used to bring your homework here? Laura asked, settling onto the ground. Her voice was gentle, almost playful. Molly nodded, sitting cross-legged nearby. Math problems spread all over that wooden bench. She smiled, pointing to a weathered seat just outside the enclosure. And you'd quiz me while feeding the animals. Marley's ears perked up at their voices. He lifted his head, watching them with renewed interest. Look at that, Laura whispered, trying to contain her excitement. He's more alert today. As they continued talking, sharing memories both sweet and painful, Marley slowly inched closer. His movements were cautious but deliberate, each step bringing him nearer to the women. I found my old diary yesterday, Molly said, her voice softening. I wrote about the baby raccoons you rescued when I was 12. How proud I felt helping you feed them. Laura's eyes welled up. You were such a natural with them. I should have told you that more often. Marley approached his food bowl, sniffing tentatively. Both women held their breath, hardly daring to move. To their amazement, he began to eat, finishing the entire portion for the first time in weeks. Oh, Marley, Laura breathed, relief flooding her face. She reached for her phone with trembling hands, quickly dialing Dr. Tolan to share the news. His voice crackled through the speaker, full of enthusiasm. This is exactly what we hoped for. Keep up the sessions. They're clearly working wonders. Watching Marley settle down for a nap near them, Molly saw him differently now. He wasn't just another rescue animal that had taken her mother's attention. He was living proof of her mother's capacity to love, to heal, to persist despite overwhelming odds. They sat in comfortable silence as Marley dozed, his chest rising and falling peacefully. Laura reached over and squeezed Molly's hand. For the first time in years, hope bloomed in both their hearts. Not just for Marley's recovery, but for their own healing journey together. The afternoon sun filtered through Laura's office window, casting long shadows across her cluttered desk. She shuffled through a stack of feeding schedules, trying to focus on the familiar routine, when her phone buzzed. Dr. Patel's name lit up the screen. Laura's hand trembled as she reached for the phone. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before answering. Hello, Dr. Patel. The doctor's voice was gentle but direct. Laura, I've received your latest test results. I'm afraid they're not what we hoped for. Laura's fingers tightened around the phone as Dr. Patel explained that the current treatment wasn't working. The words aggressive surgery and significant risks echoed in her mind. followed by the devastating alternative, a drastically shortened timeline. "I understand if you need time to think about this," Dr. Patel said softly. Laura managed a quiet, "Thank you," before hanging up. She sat motionless at her desk, the sanctuary's usual afternoon sounds fading into a distant hum. Hours passed in a blur. Laura barely noticed when Molly knocked on her office door carrying 2 cups of tea. "Mom? Everything okay?" Molly's concerned voice broke through the fog. "Just tired," Laura mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "I think I'll skip Marley's session today." "But we've been making such good progress," Molly pressed gently. "I said I'm tired," Laura snapped, immediately regretting her tone. I need some time alone." That evening, Laura retreated to her bedroom. She could hear Marley's distressed pacing through the open window and Molly's footsteps in the hallway. But she couldn't bring herself to face either of them. Sitting on her bed, Laura picked up the silver-framed photo from her nightstand. Her husband's smiling face looked back at her, frozen in a happier time. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she traced his image with her finger. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice breaking in the quiet room. The morning sunlight streamed through the sanctuary kitchen windows, casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the heavy silence inside. Molly moved methodically around the kitchen, the coffee maker gurgling as she dropped 2 pieces of bread into the toaster. At the table, Laura sat perfectly still, her hands wrapped around an empty mug, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. "Your coffee's getting cold," Molly said, placing a fresh cup beside her mother. Laura didn't respond, lost in her own world of worry and fear. "Mom, what's going on?" Molly's voice grew sharper. "You've barely said 2 words since yesterday." Laura blinked, finally looking up. "I'm fine, just tired." "No, you're not fine. This is exactly what you always do. Shut everyone out when things get tough." Molly slammed the butter knife down on the counter. "You did it when Dad died. You did it when I needed you growing up, and you're doing it again now." "Stop meddling in things you don't understand," Laura snapped, pushing her chair back from the table. "I don't need you telling me how to handle my problems." "Of course not, because the great Laura Bennett never needs anyone's help, right? It was always easier to hide with your precious animals than to be there for your own daughter." "I did the best I could," Laura's voice cracked. "Everything I did was to keep this place running, to give us both a home." "A home?" Molly laughed bitterly. "This place was never my home. It was your escape. While you were playing savior to every injured animal that came along, I was the one who had to figure everything out alone." Laura's face crumpled as the truth of Molly's words hit home. I never meant to." But Molly was already storming out of the kitchen, leaving Laura standing alone with the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her shoulders. The afternoon stretched on endlessly. Molly threw herself into caring for the animals, methodically working through the feeding schedule while sharing her frustrations with Rachel. "Your mom seems really troubled," Rachel said gently as they filled water troughs. "Maybe she just needs some time." Meanwhile, Laura remained in her room, skipping lunch and avoiding any contact with the outside world. As evening approached, she finally ventured to her office window, watching as Marley paced restlessly in his enclosure. Her heart sank when she saw his untouched food bowl. Marley's agitated movements mirrored the turmoil in her own heart. He walked back and forth, his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible distress. Laura pressed her hand against the cool glass, watching helplessly as her faithful companion once again began to reflect her own emotional state. The sunrise painted the sanctuary in shades of amber, but Laura couldn't appreciate its beauty. She stood rigid outside Marley's enclosure, her hands gripping the metal fence as she watched him pace, back and forth, back and forth. His agitation was like a knife in her heart. Just days ago, he'd been calm, even playful. Now his distress was unmistakable. Her phone buzzed. Dr. Tolan's name flashed on the screen. "How's our patient doing?" His voice was warm, concerned. Laura's throat tightened. Not so good. He's regressed." "Laura," Dr. Tolan said gently, "remember what we discussed. Marley picks up on your emotional state. Is everything all right?" Before Laura could answer, footsteps crunched on gravel behind her. Molly stood there, arms crossed. "What's really going on, Mom?" Molly demanded as Laura ended the call. "First you shut down. Now Marley's worse. Something's not right." "Ha! It's nothing," Laura muttered, turning back to the enclosure. "Stop lying." Molly's voice cracked with frustration. "I heard you on the phone yesterday. Something about treatment options. Are you sick? Is that what this is about?" Laura's hands trembled. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me." "I can't." Laura's voice wavered. "I can't do the surgery. I'm thinking of stopping treatment altogether." The silence that followed was deafening. "You're what?" Molly's face drained of color. "You're giving up? Without even telling me?" "Molly!" "No!" Molly backed away, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to make that decision alone. You don't get to just give up." She turned and ran toward the house, leaving Laura alone with her guilt. Laura spent the afternoon in Marley's enclosure, sitting cross-legged on the ground. But every time she tried to connect with him, to project the calm energy Dr. Tolan had encouraged, her fears crashed over her like waves. Marley kept his distance, more agitated than ever. As night fell, Laura remained in the enclosure. The weight of everything, her illness, Molly's pain, Marley's distress, finally broke through her walls. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered into the darkness. "I'm so scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this surgery. I don't know if I can face it alone." The morning dew sparkled on the grass as Molly walked through the sanctuary grounds. She stopped short when she saw Laura curled up on a bench near Marley's enclosure, wrapped in an old plaid blanket. Her mother's face looked worn, vulnerable in sleep. Molly knelt beside her, touching her shoulder gently. "Mom?" Laura stirred, blinking in confusion. "Molly? What time is it?" "Early, here." Molly pressed a warm travel mug into her mother's hands. "You must be freezing out here." They sat in awkward silence, steam rising from their coffee cups. Marley watched them from his corner, his eyes alert but calm. "I need to tell you something," Molly said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 months ago, I had a miscarriage." Laura turned sharply. "What? Why didn't you tell me?" "I thought I had to handle it alone." Molly's eyes welled with tears. "I was so used to dealing with things by myself, just like you're doing now." Laura's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "Oh, sweetheart." "When you shut people out, it doesn't make the pain less," Molly continued. "It just makes you feel more alone. I learned that the hard way." "I thought I was protecting you," Laura admitted, her voice breaking. "But I'm so scared, Molly. The surgery." "I know." Molly reached for her mother's hand. "But you don't have to face it alone. Let me be here for you, like you should have been there for me." Laura's shoulders shook as she began to cry. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for pushing you away, for all the times I wasn't there." Molly wrapped her arms around her mother, their tears mingling. "We can do better now, both of us." In his enclosure, Marley settled down closer to them, his presence steady and reassuring. "I don't want to lose you," Molly whispered. Please don't give up on the treatment." Laura squeezed her daughter's hand. "I won't. I promise I'll fight. Just stay with me." "I'm not going anywhere," Molly assured her. "We'll face this together." They stood slowly, supporting each other. For the first time in years, the distance between them felt smaller, bridged by shared pain and newfound understanding. As they walked away from Marley's enclosure, their steps fell into sync, mother and daughter united at last. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Laura and Molly sat at the old wooden table, their coffee mugs steaming between them. The morning felt different somehow, lighter, despite the weight of everything unsaid. Molly traced the rim of her cup with her finger. "Mom, have you thought about what you're going to do? About the treatment?" Laura's hands tightened around her mug. "I'm terrified," she admitted softly. "The surgery. There's so much that could go wrong." "I know." Molly reached across the table, placing her hand over her mother's. "But you're not alone anymore. Whatever happens, we'll handle it together." Laura glanced out the window toward Marley's enclosure. The bobcat lay peacefully in the morning sun, his tail swishing contentedly. "He needs me," she whispered. "You both do." "And we're here for you too." Molly squeezed her hand. "Let me help with the sanctuary while you recover. I can learn your routines, work with the volunteers." Something shifted in Laura's expression, a mixture of relief and determination. She stood up, walking to the phone mounted on the wall. "I need to make a call." Dr. Patel's office answered on the second ring. Laura's voice was steady as she scheduled the surgery, surprising herself with her newfound calm. When she hung up, Molly was already sitting at the counter with a notebook. "Okay," Molly said, pen poised. "Let's make a list of everything that needs to be done. We'll create a schedule, coordinate with the volunteers." That afternoon, Laura sat beside Marley's enclosure, her fingers gently scratching behind his ears through the bars. "I have to go away for a little while," she told him softly. "But I'm coming back. I promise." From the path nearby, Molly watched her mother and Marley together, her heart full of fierce determination. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family. The early morning mist hung low over the sanctuary grounds as Molly helped Laura into the passenger seat of her silver sedan. Laura's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her small overnight bag, her eyes fixed on the sanctuary buildings behind them. "Everything will be fine, Mom," Molly said softly, adjusting Laura's seatbelt. "Rachel knows exactly what to do." Laura nodded, but her gaze lingered on Marley's enclosure. "I just hope he understands why I'm leaving." "He does," Molly assured her, closing the passenger door gently. "He's been so much calmer lately. I think he knows we're all working together now." At the hospital, the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as nurses prepped Laura for surgery. The pre-op room smelled of disinfectant and fresh linens. Molly sat beside her mother's bed, their hands intertwined. "Molly," Laura whispered, her voice shaky. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell you sooner about any of it." Molly squeezed her mother's hand. "You're being brave now. That's what matters." "Thank you for staying," Laura said, tears welling in her eyes, "for giving me another chance." Before Molly could respond, the nurses arrived to wheel Laura to the operating room. Molly watched as they pushed the bed through the double doors, her heart pounding against her ribs. Alone in the waiting room, Molly sank into an uncomfortable chair and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through old photos, birthdays, holidays, moments she'd almost forgotten. Her thumb paused over a picture of her and Laura from years ago, both smiling at the sanctuary's opening day. The hours crawled by. Molly called Rachel twice, each update about Marley's steady behavior providing a small comfort. "He ate his entire breakfast," Rachel reported. He's been sitting near the front of his enclosure, just watching. Very peaceful. Molly paced the waiting room, her mind replaying the past few weeks. The arguments, the breakthroughs, the quiet moments of understanding that had begun to heal their relationship. She thought about how close she'd come to walking away again, and how grateful she was that she'd stayed. When the surgeon finally emerged, still wearing his scrub cap, Molly's heart stopped. His face broke into a tired smile. "The surgery was successful," he announced. "We got all of it. Your mother will need time to recover, but she did beautifully." Molly's legs went weak with relief, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her hands to her mouth. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "Thank you so much." Sunlight streamed through the hospital room window, casting a warm glow across Laura's bed. She lay propped up against white pillows, her face tired, but her eyes bright as Molly turned another page of The Secret Garden, their old favorite book. "If you look the right way, you can see that the whole world is a garden," Molly read softly, then paused. "Remember how many times we read this together?" Laura smiled weakly. "You used to beg for just one more chapter every night." She shifted, wincing at the movement. "I hate feeling so useless. There's so much that needs doing at the sanctuary." "Mom," Molly said, closing the book, "everything's fine. Rachel sent me new pictures this morning." She pulled out her phone, showing Laura photos of Marley lounging in his favorite sunny spot. "See? He's eating well and even playing with his enrichment toys." "He looks good," Laura admitted, studying the images. "You've been visiting him?" "Every evening," Molly nodded. "I sit with him just like we used to do together. You know what's funny? He seems to get more energetic each day you get stronger. Yesterday, he actually chased after his favorite ball." Laura's eyes welled up. "Really? Really? And Rachel says he perks up whenever she mentions your name." Molly squeezed her mother's hand. "He's healing right along with you." Dr. Patel stopped by during his rounds, checking Laura's vitals and surgical sight. "Remember," he said kindly, "recovery isn't just about the physical healing. Your emotional well-being matters just as much." Later that afternoon, Laura managed her first short walk around the room, holding on to Molly's arm. Though she only made it halfway before needing to rest, her determination showed in her face. "Baby steps," Molly reminded her. "Just like when you were teaching Marley to trust people again." "It's strange," Laura said, catching her breath. "I used to think I had to handle everything alone. The sanctuary, my illness, everything. But having you here," she squeezed Molly's hand. "I don't know how to thank you for all of this." Molly's eyes softened as she helped her mother back to bed. "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." The morning sun cast long shadows across the sanctuary grounds as Molly helped Laura out of the car. Laura moved slowly, one hand pressed against her healing incision, the other gripping Molly's arm. "Easy does it, Mom," Molly said softly. "We've got all day." Rachel rushed over from the supply shed, her face lighting up. "Laura, we've missed you so much." She stopped herself from hugging Laura, settling instead for a gentle pat on the shoulder. Other volunteers called out greetings as they passed, their warm welcomes bringing tears to Laura's eyes. But she knew exactly where she needed to go first. At Marley's enclosure, Laura eased herself onto the wooden bench. Marley padded over immediately, pressing against the fence with a gentle chirp. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, and his eyes were bright and alert. "Look at you," Laura whispered, reaching through to scratch behind his ears. "You're looking better than ever." Molly stood back, watching the reunion. Something clicked into place as she observed her mother's gentle movements and Marley's devoted response. The sanctuary wasn't just work for Laura, it was her heart. "You know," Molly said, sitting beside her mother, "I've been thinking about some improvements we could make. What if we expanded Marley's enclosure, added some climbing structures? Laura turned, surprised. We? And maybe we could add some educational displays for visitors, Molly continued. Interactive ones that teach people about wildlife conservation. Laura hesitated. That sounds expensive. I've been running some numbers, Molly said, pulling out her phone to show Laura her plans. With my business background, I think we could make it work. As the morning progressed, Molly took charge of the feeding schedule while Laura handled smaller tasks like updating records. They worked in comfortable synchronization, with Rachel helping bridge the gap between old routines and new ones. Later, as they walked back to the house together, Laura stopped and turned to her daughter. Molly, I need to tell you something. She touched Molly's arm. I'm so proud of the woman you've become. Molly's eyes welled up. You know what? I think I'm finally ready to let go of the past. She smiled, squeezing her mother's hand. We've got too much future to plan. The mid-morning sun warmed Laura's shoulders as she sat with Molly outside Marley's enclosure. They watched him bat around a large blue ball, his movements playful and energetic. Remember when he wouldn't even look at his food? Laura said softly, shaking her head in wonder. Now look at him. Molly smiled, pulling out her tablet. Speaking of improvements, I've been working on some plans for his enclosure. She showed Laura a detailed sketch of an expanded space with natural rock formations and climbing structures. This is incredibly detailed, Laura said, studying the drawings. I thought we could add these educational panels here, Molly explained, pointing to various spots on the design. Interactive displays that teach visitors about bobcat habitats and conservation. Rachel approached, carrying a clipboard. That would be amazing for school groups, she chimed in. The kids always ask so many questions about Marley. Laura leaned forward, genuinely interested. What else were you thinking? Well, Molly continued, encouraged by her mother's attention, we could create observation areas here and here, and these natural barriers would give Marley more privacy when he wants it. Rachel nodded enthusiastically. He loves climbing on the logs we already have. More vertical space would be perfect for him. Marley padded over to the enclosure bars, watching them with curious eyes. Laura reached out to scratch his ears through the fence. You know, Laura said thoughtfully, I've always dreamed of making this place more than just an animal sanctuary. I wanted it to be somewhere people could find peace too. We could do that, Molly said, already typing notes on her tablet. I know some grant writers who specialize in wildlife education projects, and with a proper donor program. You really think we could make all this happen? Laura asked, gesturing at the plans. Mom, with your experience and my business background, absolutely. Marley chirped softly, pressing against the fence as they talked. Laura watched him, then turned to her daughter with tears in her eyes. I never imagined the sanctuary could become something we shared like this. Molly smiled, reaching for her mother's hand. Maybe it always was. We just couldn't see it. Dark clouds rolled across the sky as the first heavy raindrops pelted the sanctuary grounds. Laura looked up from her paperwork at the sound of thunder rumbling in the distance. Mom! Molly burst through the office door. The storm's coming in fast. We need to secure everything. They rushed outside together, where Rachel was already helping other volunteers check enclosure latches. The wind whipped their hair as they moved from shelter to shelter, making sure every animal was protected. The supplies in the shed, Laura shouted over the howling wind. We need to... A loud crack split the air. Laura's heart stopped as she watched a massive tree branch crash onto the fence of Marley's enclosure. The metal groaned under the weight, bending inward. Marley! Laura started forward, but her legs wobbled, her body still weak from surgery. I've got this, Molly said firmly, steadying her mother. Rachel, get the emergency repair kit. Tom, Bring the temporary fencing panels." Laura watched in amazement as Molly took control of the situation, directing the staff with clear, precise instructions. Marley remained calm in his shelter, watching them work with alert eyes. Despite Laura's protests, Molly insisted she help by holding the flashlight while the team secured metal supports against the damaged section. Rain soaked through their clothes, but nobody complained as they worked together. "Almost there," Molly called out, checking the reinforcements. "One more panel." Hours passed before the storm finally moved on, leaving puddles and scattered debris in its wake. The sanctuary was messy, but intact. Most importantly, every animal was safe. In the staff room, volunteers passed around hot coffee and shared nervous laughs about their storm experience. Rachel distributed dry towels while recounting how quickly everyone had responded to the crisis. Laura stood at the window, watching the clouds clear. Behind her, Molly organized cleanup assignments for the next day, her voice confident and sure. Pride swelled in Laura's chest, not just for the sanctuary's resilience, but for her daughter's strength and leadership. "We make a pretty good team," Molly said, joining her at the window. Laura squeezed her daughter's hand. "We always did. I just forgot that for a while." Laura sat at her desk, the soft glow of her bedside lamp casting shadows across the paper. Her hand trembled slightly as she began to write. "My dearest Molly," she penned, tears welling in her eyes. "There are so many things I should have said years ago." She wrote about watching Molly grow up, remembering birthday parties half attended because of sanctuary emergencies, school plays missed due to injured animals. Each memory brought a fresh wave of regret. "I thought I was teaching you about dedication and responsibility," Laura wrote, "but instead, I made you feel second best. You were never second best, sweetheart. You were everything to me. I just didn't know how to show it." She described her pride in the woman Molly had become, strong, capable, and compassionate despite her mother's mistakes. Laura poured out her gratitude for Molly's support during her illness, and how watching her care for Marley had opened her eyes to all she'd missed. The next morning, Laura found Molly having coffee on the porch. Without a word, she handed over the envelope and walked away, giving her daughter space to read. 20 minutes later, Molly found Laura in her office. Her eyes were red, the letter clutched in her hand. "Mom," Molly's voice cracked, "this is the first time I've felt like you really see me." Laura stood, uncertain. "I should have seen you all along." "I spent so many years being angry," Molly said, moving closer, "feeling like the sanctuary was more important than me. But reading this," she held up the letter, "you finally understand." "I do," Laura whispered. "And I'm so sorry it took me this long." Molly wiped her eyes. "I think I'm ready to let go of that anger now. We've both changed so much these past few weeks." Laura reached for the letter. "Maybe we should frame this as a reminder of how far we've come and how far we can still go," Molly added, stepping into her mother's embrace. They held each other tightly, years of hurt and misunderstanding melting away in the warmth of their newfound understanding. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the sanctuary as volunteers hung colorful banners near Marley's newly expanded enclosure. Laura watched from a bench as Marley explored his new space, pawing at enrichment toys and investigating every corner with renewed energy. "He looks like his old self again," Rachel remarked, setting up chairs for the guests. Visitors began arriving, their excited chatter filling the air. Molly managed the crowd with natural ease, directing people to refreshments and answering questions about the new educational displays she'd designed. Laura stepped up to address the gathering, her voice steady despite her nerves. "When Marley stopped eating months ago, I thought I was losing him," she began. "But what I didn't realize was that his struggle would teach me the most important lesson of all, that we're stronger when we let others help us fight our battles. She turned to Molly, who stood near the enclosure. My daughter taught me that. She came home when I needed her most, even though I hadn't earned that kindness. Laura's voice cracked with emotion. She helped save not just Marley, but me too. Molly wiped tears from her eyes as the crowd applauded. Then she stepped forward, unveiling a bronze plaque beside the enclosure entrance. The Bennett Sanctuary Legacy, she read aloud, dedicated to Thomas Bennett, whose love for wildlife lives on through his family. Laura covered her mouth, overwhelmed by the tribute to her late husband. Marley approached the front of his enclosure, as if sensing the significance of the moment. Rachel shared her own memories of working with Laura, describing how the sanctuary had become a second home to so many volunteers and rescued animals. Laura taught us that healing isn't just for the animals, it's for all of us who find peace here. As the celebration continued, guests admired Molly's educational displays about bobcat behavior and habitat conservation. Children pressed their faces against the viewing windows, delighted when Marley playfully batted at his new toys. When the crowd began to thin, Laura and Molly sat together on a bench near the enclosure. They watched Marley stretch out in a patch of sunlight, his contentment evident in every relaxed muscle. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Laura said softly to her daughter. The afternoon sun warmed the sanctuary grounds as Laura sat on her porch, watching Molly guide a group of visitors through the sanctuary. Her daughter's voice carried across the yard, clear and confident as she explained the sanctuary's mission. And here, Molly was saying, is where we're planning our new educational center. It'll help children understand why protecting wildlife matters. Laura smiled, remembering how different things had been just months ago. Back then, she'd been drowning in secrets and fear, while Marley's declining health had mirrored her own struggles. Now, she watched as Molly expertly answered questions and shared stories about the animals, especially Marley. In his expanded enclosure, Marley lounged in the dappled shade of an oak tree. His coat gleamed healthy and bright, his eyes alert as he watched the visitors. Sometimes he would roll onto his back, showing off for the crowd in a way that always made Laura's heart swell. When the tour ended, Molly joined Laura on the porch with 2 glasses of lemonade. I've been thinking, Molly said, pulling out her tablet. We could start a summer program for local schools, maybe even partner with some wildlife photographers for workshops. Laura nodded, touched by how naturally Molly had stepped into her role at the sanctuary. This place is as much yours now as it is mine, she said softly. I never imagined we'd be here, planning its future together. I was thinking we could use Marley's story, Molly continued. Show people how animals and humans can heal each other. There are so many families who could benefit from that message. They spent the afternoon discussing their vision, combining Laura's years of experience with Molly's fresh perspective. The sanctuary had always been Laura's refuge, but now it was becoming something more, a bridge that had helped heal the gap between mother and daughter. As evening approached, they walked to Marley's enclosure together. He came to greet them, rubbing against the fence as Laura scratched behind his ears. Standing there with Molly by her side and Marley content before them, Laura felt complete. We're ready for whatever comes next, she whispered as a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. If you enjoyed the story of Laura, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.